Hi, my name is Aaron Schuman. I'm an American photographer, writer, and curator based in the United Kingdom. And today I just wanted to talk about my project Slant, which was published by Mack in 2019, and just give a bit of backstory and how it came about. So this project started in the summer of 2014 when my family and I went to visit my parents in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I was going through their local newspaper, which comes to their house once a week for free, and discovered a page called Police Reports, which is basically a report of all of the reasons why the police had been called out during the course of the previous week. And I discovered texts like this: Citizens Assistance, 4:14 a.m. A man shoveling snow on State Street told police he saw a strange orange glow coming from the eastern sky that might have been something on fire. Police determined the glow was probably the sun coming up for the day. Suspicious activity, 2:48 a.m. An Anne Whalen Apartments resident awoke to find someone on her balcony looking into her bedroom. The woman later told police she thinks she may have been dreaming prior to calling 911. So I found these texts quite interesting and also pretty funny, and I started going through back issues of the newspaper that were lying around my parents' house to see if I could find more of these kinds of incidents. And for the most part, the reports were pretty banal. Often it would be a party that got too loud and the police were called, or a animal escaped and had been found. Um, but I did discover that every week or two, there was probably one, two, maybe three of these slightly surreal and absurd reports of nothing really happening, and yet the police being called. Things like the sun rising for the day, or someone having a dream. So after I returned to the UK, I asked my father if he would collect these over the course of the next few weeks and months and send them back to me back in England. So every few months I would receive a package that looked a bit like this, um, that would be stuffed full of several months' worth of police reports from the Amherst Bulletin. And I would spend the Sunday afternoon kind of going through these slowly and carefully, trying to pick out the ones that I thought were interesting. They would arrive with a note, something like this: Dear Aaron, at last, sorry for the delay. As you can see, the crime wave continues. The first week, I started circling the humorous items. I then decided to let you discover them for yourself. Enjoy. Love to all. Dad. So the crime wave that my father's talking about includes noise complaints, 6:36 a.m. Strange sounds coming from the woods near Mill Valley Estates were determined to be trees creaking due to cold temperatures. 11:22 p.m. Two people sitting on a pile of dirt near the Olympia Place construction site were sent on their way by police. They told police they were just discussing their relationship. And I also discovered within a lot of these reports that there was this reoccurring character of the photographer. Suspicious activity, 5:53 p.m. A woman called police after being approached by a photographer in downtown who asked if he could take pictures of her feet. The photographer was not located. Suspicious activity, 11:03 a.m. An Amherst woman told police a neighbor who has behaved in odd ways is using a camera to photograph her home. So I started thinking about these reports as potentially the foundations for a photography project, and I started to think about how I might make photographs in relationship to these texts. And what I really liked about these texts was how kind of matter-of-fact and deadpan they were, and yet within them they contained something slightly absurd, slightly strange, slightly surreal. So in the summer of 2016, I returned to Amherst, Massachusetts, and I kept reading these texts that were specifically about photographers. Suspicious activity, 4:40 p.m. A man who walked through the drive-through of a downtown bank and took several photographs of the interior was located a short time later. He told police the pictures are part of an art project he's doing as an Amherst College student. 9:16 p.m. A man asleep inside a vehicle parked at the Emmanuel Lutheran Church parking lot was awoken. He told police he was attending a photography conference at UMass, couldn't afford a hotel room, and would be driving back to New York City in the morning. So as I started making these photographs, again, I wanted to maintain this particular tone of the texts, this very kind of straight, deadpan, matter-of-fact type of photography, something that's very common within the traditions of particularly American documentary photography, in the lines of people like Walker Evans, Paul Strand, Robert Adams, and so on. And with these kind of very straight photographs, these very matter-of-fact photographs, I wanted to have one or two little details within them that might allude to something a bit off, a bit different happening within the pictures, so that this kind of very traditional leafy New England town that looks very normal and quiet has hints of these little surreal and absurd moments going on within them. And some of the photographs started to feel like they lent themselves to particular texts. So, for example, the woman who woke up and called 911 because somebody was looking in her window and then discovered she was dreaming, aligned with a photograph like this. But the idea really was to kind of find ways that I could make photographs that would sit comfortably with the texts and try to determine some sort of strategy where the photographs didn't necessarily overwhelm the texts and the text didn't necessarily overwhelm the photographs. I didn't want the photographs to necessarily be illustrations of the texts, and I didn't want the texts to be captions for the photographs, but I did want them to have some sort of relationship. So as I made these photographs, I had the texts in the back of my mind, but I wasn't necessarily trying to match them in any particular kind of way. Of course, occasionally there were these kind of perfect moments where I'd be thinking about a text like the photographer photographing feet in downtown and not really know how I might go about making a picture of that. And then all of a sudden on the side of the road would appear something like this, and it felt almost too good to be true. And for example, this is a photograph that I made when I was walking through the graveyard where Emily Dickinson is buried. And I should say that Emily Dickinson was born and raised and lived and worked and died in Amherst, Massachusetts. She was known as the myth of Amherst, or the ghost of Amherst. She was quite reclusive. She stayed at home much of her time, writing her poetry and keeping to herself. So when I went to make this photograph, I was looking to see maybe there was some kind of potential image that I could make around Emily Dickinson's grave, but I discovered this instead. So once I gathered some photographs and I had a collection of texts ready to go, I started thinking about ways in which I might be able to combine text and image within a kind of book form so that they would work together and not necessarily, again, kind of have a specific relationship, but to have something a little bit looser. And I started thinking about photography books that I had and that I'd seen over the course of my lifetime that incorporated both text and image, and particularly images that were related to certain activities within related to crime or police activity. So, for example, one of the books that I would look at is Ouija's Naked City, which is a book that combines the photographs that he made of crime scenes for various kind of tabloids in New York in the 1930s and 40s and 50s with texts that were written, these kinds of short texts that kind of described what was going on in the pictures. But of course, Amherst isn't New York, Lower East Side in the 1930s, so the activities weren't quite as salacious. So I also looked at books like Suburbia by Bill Owens, which is a book that he made while working as a local newspaper photographer in suburban California, where he would combine photographs and portraits that he'd made of the inhabitants of these suburbs with quotes that he gathered from them. And they create this really interesting dialogue between this very seemingly American dreamlike suburban landscape and then what goes on behind closed doors and in the kind of minds of the people that live there. Then, of course, there's books like Wisconsin Death Trip by Michael Lessie. I should say that Michael Lessie is a professor at Hampshire College, which is a college that's located in Amherst, Massachusetts, so that was quite a nice link. But this book is well known in terms of its combination of found texts from newspapers and diaries and so on of this community, and also photographs that were made at the time in the late 19th century. And then also American Prospects, a book by Joel Sternfeld, published in the 1980s, where he was traveling around America. And I really like about this book, again, the way that he combines this very kind of straight approach to photography, but also discovering these surreal moments that happen within the American landscape in this kind of deadpan, matter-of-fact way. So for example, even the cover image is this very famous photograph of a fireman buying a pumpkin while his colleagues fight a fire in the background. And then of course there was a body of work that was being made pretty much concurrently. I started this project in 2014-15, and I think Alex Soth and Brad Zeller were working on their LBM dispatches up until about 2015, where they would travel to different towns and parts of America and play the role of newspaper reporters and a newspaper photographer. But Soth's photographs, again, are these kinds of cryptic images that don't necessarily reveal too much. They're quite ambiguous and mysterious. And then Brad Zeller's texts kind of match that. So they were taking on the role of the newspaper photographer, but producing something a little bit more ambiguous and a little bit more open and general. For me, the most important book while I was making this project was Time in New England, which is a book that includes photographs by Paul Strand and also texts that have been selected and edited by Nancy Newhall, the writer and curator. And this was a book where these two people collaborated and brought together their respective work. So Paul Strand in the late 1940s was making photographs in New England. He would make several trips up to New England. And at the same time, Nancy Newhall would be going through different libraries and archives and collections of books, looking for texts that related specifically to New England and the spirit of New England, and consequently the spirit of what they described as the spirit of America. And they would kind of work together back and forth over the course of several months and try to bring Paul Strand's photographs together with Nancy Newhall's texts. And this is a description of how they were working. So it says, eventually, Paul Strand and Mrs. Newhall sat down together and worked out a combination of texts and photographs in associations that were poetic rather than concrete. The result was Time in New England, published in 1950. Strand found that the process of making a book in which texts and photographs interacted so as to enrich one another appealed to him enormously. It was a major turning point in my whole development, he said. So I really like this idea of bringing text and photograph together in poetic links rather than concrete links, and also this idea of having text and photographs enrich one another. So again, rather than them simply describing one another, something new is created when they're put side by side. And the way that this book is organized also really intrigued me. As you can see from the table of contents here, the photographs, which are listed on the left, and the texts, which are listed on the right, are kind of combined in this slightly loose form, where you might have 3 texts and then 2 photographs, and then 1 text, and then 1 photograph, and then 5 texts, and then 4 more photographs. So there was this kind of loose association going on between the two things. And the texts that are included in the book are really broad. They come from all sorts of different sources, from poetry by Henry David Thoreau and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Emily Dickinson and Herman Melville, to speeches by abolitionists and union leaders, to letters written back and forth between the colonists that first arrived in New England and people back in England. So I was really interested in this kind of loose association approach. And I also like this idea of having these loose chapters that are based around themes like the sea, fine auroras, protest, abolition, and so on. And again, the way the book is laid out is that you have these kinds of texts combined with images. So for example, in this spread, you have 2 poems by the poet Emily Dickinson, who again comes from Amherst, Massachusetts. And then you have a kind of suite of photographs by Paul Strand. Sometimes they're double-page spreads, sometimes there's a single image, sometimes you have a single image with 1 text, sometimes you have a double-page spread of texts. In fact, this is a text that's describing the funeral of Emily Dickinson, and you can see that Amherst is mentioned in the book itself. It says, "To Amherst, to the funeral of that rare and strange creature, Emily Dickinson." Another thing that was really important to me was a tour that I took of the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, Massachusetts. During the tour guide kind of sat everybody down and explained a little bit about Dickinson's approach to poetry. And he discussed this notion of slant rhyme, which is something that Dickinson famously used quite often. And in fact, this poem here, which appears in Time in New England, um, incorporates slant rhyme. So in the last stanza, you can see it says, "And then to go to sleep, and then if it should be, the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to die." So the idea of slant rhyme is that you have two words that almost rhyme, but don't rhyme. And they create this kind of sense of dissonance and this kind of slightly uncomfortable feeling between the two words, where your mind, or if you're reading it out loud, your voice wants to make the two words rhyme, but you can't. And it creates something a little bit disturbing and uncomfortable and offsetting. So the words be and die feel like they should rhyme. You want to say, and then if it should be the will of its inquisitor, the liberty to d, but you can't. You have to say die. So there's this really interesting slanted relationship between the two words, where you know that they're linked in some way, but they're linked loosely, and they're also linked in this way that makes you feel a little bit off balance and uncomfortable. So I really like that idea of slant rhyme, and I really like the idea of incorporating text and image in these kinds of loose associations. And so I took my lead in terms of the design of the book and the layout of the book from Time in New England, in the sense that it's designed so that there are several texts on a page, and then those texts might be followed by a suite of 3, 4, 5, 8 images, and then it returns to some more texts. And so all of a sudden these relationships are created where some of the texts relate directly to the image that might be next to it, but also the other texts are loosely associated with that same image, and vice versa. So you can have situations where one text might refer to 3 or 4 different photographs and enrich them in new and interesting ways. And similarly, you might have one image that might be related to 3 or 4 texts, or one text that might be related to 3 or 4 images. So you have this back and forth kind of thing going on. And again, the book is laid out very much like Time in New England in that respect. This this collection of texts followed by a collection of images and then a return to a collection of texts. I should say the book is also beautifully designed in the sense that it uses several different paper stocks. So you have a kind of newspaper-like paper stock where the newspaper clippings are printed, these police reports, and then you have a kind of more traditional paper for photographic prints. And the photographs are printed in tritone with a nice varnish, so they feel like photographic prints. And then the police reports feel like they're on kind of a newspaper-like print. So even tactily, as you go through the book, you have an experience similar to the one that I was having when I was editing and playing with these two things. And again, I was following the lead of the Paul Strand book and Nancy Newhall's book, in the sense that I like this idea of some double page spreads combining text and image, and others just being a single image or a diptych. Also, over the course of this project, which I was working on from 2014 to 2018, initially the project started as something that was slightly humorous, slightly funny, slightly absurd, and I thought that was enough. But I started realizing that within the context of the 2016 election and the rise of Donald Trump and the right within America, there were certain themes that seemed to be kind of coming to the surface as I was collecting these and trying to make sense of them, and also thinking about ways in which I might create some sort of chapters within the book. So some of those themes include things like paranoia. So for example, those earlier texts that I showed of people worrying about the sun rising being something on fire, or people peering into their windows, people constantly watching them, looking at them, photographing them, surveying them. So that was one of the kind of themes that I started, and motifs that I started playing with, was that notion of paranoia. Another one was something like xenophobia, and this kind of rise of a fear of the other. So for example, these 3 texts We have 6:32 p.m. A man described as having a wild hairdo on a West Street porch was not located by police. The man was likely a solicitor going door to door in the neighborhood. 7:32 p.m. Residents at the Boulders complained about a man yelling out the window in a foreign language. The man told police he was just stating his excitement for the dinner he was about to eat. 9:40 p.m. A South Amherst resident told police he got a phone call from a person claiming to be an Afghan soldier who had him in his crosshairs due to his involvement in local civil rights issues. The resident called police again the following day to report additional prank calls from the same person, who spoke with a Middle Eastern accent. And so again, the photographs are meant to kind of follow that same motif, a sense of fear, a sense of fear of the foreign, of the different, of the strange. One 1:47 p.m., police were notified by a downtown resident concerned with a neighbor who allegedly is keeping a green monkey as a pet. Animal complaints, 10:42 a.m. A townhouse apartments resident reported that 9 days earlier, she was bitten by her own dog, treated by the Department of Public Health. Noise complaints, 8:14 p.m. A man reportedly playing an electric guitar for an extended period of time at a Summer Street residence was trying to learn the song Seek and Destroy by Metallica, police determined. Another motif that seemed pertinent to the time and place we were living in and that I was working in uh, was this idea of kind of misogyny and sexism. Suspicious activity, 1:15 p.m. A man reported he was uncomfortable with a protester standing at the intersection of Amity and South Pleasant Streets with a sign stating Kill Feminism. 4:05 p.m. Iota Gamma Epsilon residents were advised to take down a sign they placed on the front lawn reading Freshman Daughter Drop-Off Site. Suspicious activity, 12:32 a.m. College-aged women waiting at a bus stop near Puffton Village told police they were approached by a suspicious man who asked if they were ready to have fun tonight. The man was not located. Suspicious activity, 4:44 a.m. Strange sounds coming from a Harkness Road building were determined to be acorns falling against a metal roof. And another motif that kind of kept surfacing was what was going on behind closed doors in a lot of these neighborhoods and this particular community, and in particular, different types of relationships, sexual behavior, love. 8:30 p.m. A man wearing only a bathrobe running in the middle of West Street near Atkins Corner roundabouts was located by Amherst police. The man told police he was out on a punishing run after breaking up with his boyfriend at Hampshire College. College officers transported the man back to the nearby campus. Noise complaints, 7:19 p.m. Residents at the Boulders reported a loud argument between a man and a woman and banging on the walls that caused a painting in their apartment to fall to the floor. Police determined that the neighbors were engaged in what was described as overzealous copulation and were not arguing. Suspicious activity, 7:07 a.m. A Heatherstone resident reported being awoken to the song Endless Love and told police an intruder may have entered the home. The residence was secure, according to police, and the source of the music was not identified. So ultimately, this project was really an attempt to not only gather together these texts, these kinds of absurdist, surreal texts, and some slightly strange photographs, but was also ultimately, by the end of it, I realized that it was revealing certain underlying issues that were coming to the surface of the American consciousness, of the American experience, all through this kind of very small town in a very subtle way. And the idea of things like paranoia, xenophobia, misogyny, suspicious sexual behavior, so-called, um, revealed something about what was happening in America during this time, whereby the 2016 election was happening and then happened. And even within this small town and this small community, which is populated by universities and university students, academics, left-leaning liberals, this is a part of the country and part of America that's well known for being very much left-leaning. All of a sudden, even within this landscape, certain slightly disturbing and troubling issues were bubbling underneath the surface and rising to it. At the beginning of the book, I include this poem by Emily Dickinson again. And I think it really reveals a lot of what I was getting at and what I was discovering by doing this project, and hopefully people looking at the book will discover as well. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. So thanks so much for listening. I hope it provided some insight into the book. Please support your favorite independent publishers and your local bookshops. Take care of yourselves. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.